So, you've read an article, or you've seen a YouTube video, or you've watched a telly program, or your doctor wants to refer you, or you heard a podcast, or you bumped into an old friend down the pub and got chatting. Every single one of us, those of us who get diagnosed with ADHD later in life, has that hold on a minute moment. There is a very precise focus point in all of our lives, a decisive moment in which a chilly wave of recognition crests and then spills on our heads. It's the starting point for a new journey that's going to take you on some unexpected twists and turns. You'll make some discoveries about yourself that will be both cruel and ecstatic in equal measure. And when you come out of it the other side, you will not be the same person. And if you are at that moment in your life when ADHD is looming large, then this series of videos is just for you. I am someone who was in your shoes a few years ago, and I wanted to share my knowledge with folks who are just starting out on that adult ADHD journey in the hope that it might have a smoother ride than me. Most of the content I discovered that related to it reduced ADHD into a kind of bland meme, a simplified and Disneyfied view of the disorder, which made no sense to me in the light of my own train wreck of a life. My content is not like that. I'm a big believer in speaking to truth and being honest, and it's that honesty and desire to face up to the actual reality of ADHD which is at the core of this little series of mine. There are 4 videos in this series covering the whole adult ADHD journey through pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, post-diagnosis, and finally the long-term situation. So let's kick things off by talking about all things pre-diagnosis. The starting point for any full ADHD diagnosis is the moment when somebody first wonders if they might have it. In my case, I read an article in the Guardian newspaper about 6 years ago now, and I was struck by the echoes of my own life in the story of discovery written by that journalist. The natural next step for anyone who begins to suspect they have ADHD is to learn more. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, an impairment in the growth and development of the brain, and it's one of a group of such disorders. Specifically, it's a physical difference in the brain that impairs a couple of very particular feel-good and motivational chemicals that function as critically important messengers. These chemical messengers, called neurotransmitters, sound quite benign, but they are crucial to being the sort of functional human being that can get an education, hold down a job, have a long-term relationship with someone, not mangle themselves in a car accident or die from a drug overdose. People with ADHD are primarily deficient in neurotransmitters that produce norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, and dopamine. Deficiencies in these specific neurotransmitters results in inattention, problems with organisation, issues with executive functions, emotional volatility, memory, focus, willpower, mood, movement, anxiety, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. When we state that people with ADHD are deficient in these key neurotransmitters, we are saying that the fine balancing act that is essential for a properly functioning human brain has been disrupted. The chemicals that relay a particular subset of motivational signals around the brain are not being produced in sufficient quantities. As such, ADHD is a physical and biological deficiency, not a psychological issue, and therefore it cannot be talked out, unlearned, or retrained. It can only be managed. Like all neurological disorders, an ADHD diagnosis does not mean a guaranteed list of symptoms that can be ticked off from a checklist. Just as there are different kinds of autism and different degrees of impairment, so it is with ADHD. At the moment, scientific psychiatric bodies generally agree that there are 3 main types of ADHD. hyperactive impulsive, inattentive, and combined. The hyperactive type is probably best known among the general public and, ironically, the least prevalent, with only around 7% of people falling into this particular category. The inattentive type is typically, but not exclusively, how ADHD manifests itself in girls, and it's also the most common variant, with around 60% of people falling into this category. The combined type, as the name suggests, is a composite of the other two type variants and is the type of ADHD diagnosed in about 30% of people. Since combined type is an amalgamation of all the aforementioned symptoms, it's also the most severe form of ADHD. So that's a basic definition. How do you best find out about the realities of ADHD? In the old days, finding out would have meant a trip to the library, but these days, YouTube is usually the first place someone looks. There is plenty of ADHD material on YouTube catering to a diverse audience. But if you want to get straight to the good stuff, I've included a bunch of links in this video's description down below. If you watch just one video, I strongly suggest you choose a Dr. Russell Barkley lecture, because he's simply the foremost ADHD expert on the planet and a brilliant and engaging public speaker. Now, the important thing at this early stage of the game is to hold your expectations in check. Platforms like TikTok are full of people who are self-diagnosed, and the simple truth is that many of them do not have ADHD. They are often not the best source of information. TikTok is unfortunately full of fake disorder videos. The fake disorder videos are usually pretty easy to spot because the person making them actually has no fucking idea what the disorder is like, and so they accentuate the most well-known symptoms of that disorder in the most cringe-inducing way imaginable. So when it comes to TikTok in particular, trust your gut feeling. The quality of videos on YouTube is much higher, of course, and fortunately the algorithm tends to surface the quality ADHD videos over the fake ones. If you prefer to learn about ADHD in a book, then I point you in the direction of the aforementioned Dr. Russell Barkley's back catalogue on Amazon. In particular, his books When an Adult You Love Has ADHD, Professional Advice for Parents, Partners and Siblings, and Taking Charge of Adult ADHD, Proven Strategies to Success at Work, at Home and in Relationships. For slightly more oblique looks at ADHD, check out Dirty Laundry, Why Adults with ADHD Are So Ashamed and What We Can Do to Help, and Your Brain's Not Broken, Strategies for Navigating Your Emotions and Life with ADHD. I'll put the links to these books down below. For podcasts, check out the ADHD Adults podcast, ADHD as Females, and Attitude ADHD Experts podcast. So now you've worked your way through 50 YouTube videos and several books, and you're starting to feel quite strongly now that you might have it. You, my friend, have a choice to make. Do you want to pursue a diagnosis, or are you happy to simply live with the knowledge that you might have ADHD? There's no definitive answer to this question. It's one that we all have to answer for ourselves. If you've had a successful life so far, you've got a good job and good relationships with family and friends, and you don't feel disadvantaged in any particular way, then you might decide to maintain the status quo. If you feel that you have nothing to gain from a proper diagnosis, then there's nothing wrong with leaving things be. All I would say on that matter is that if you are a parent or thinking of becoming a parent, then you should consider a proper diagnosis and investment in your child's future. This is because ADHD is a familial disorder passed down through the genes, and if you have it, there's a really strong chance your kids will have it too. You could save yourself and your child a lot of drama in the future by getting in front of this thing. Picture your own childhood, and now picture it if you, your parents and your school knew you had a neurodevelopmental disorder. Of course, there are other familial connections to consider when you're deciding whether or not to go for a full diagnosis. When I got my diagnosis, I remember speaking to my brother about it at length. After our conversation, he decided to find out if he had it, and did, in fact, a few months later, get his own positive ADHD diagnosis. Knowing for sure that you have ADHD can also shed new light on your relationship with your parents. Looking back, I'm absolutely certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mother had ADHD, along with a bunch of other disorders, and it has helped me understand the way she behaved when I was a kid. Gender also plays a part in whether someone chooses to get a full ADHD assessment, with males vastly outnumbering females in pretty much every developed nation on earth. There are many reasons for this, above and beyond the age-old issue of boys simply getting more attention than girls. ADHD tends to present differently in women, and women are much better at masking ADHD symptoms. This ability to fly under the radar probably plays a part in the decision not to get assessed. But there's little doubt that ADHD is massively underdiagnosed in females compared to males. What is certainly true is that the presence of ADHD does not favour males or females, and any disparity is down to societal factors, not the raw biological statistics. One aspect of a potential diagnosis that you should consider is that you may also be diagnosed for comorbidities. I got diagnosed with autism about 3 years before my ADHD diagnosis, but if you're seeing a clinical psychiatrist, there's a strong possibility they'll identify other disorders during the process and perhaps suggest a separate diagnosis. Autism is strongly linked with ADHD, as is bipolar, Tourette's, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, along with numerous other disorders. The most common comorbidities are depression and bipolar. Deciding that you want to get properly assessed is one thing, but actually getting that done is another. Standards in mental health care and the attitudes to it around the world vary enormously, and it's often not as simple as deciding that you want to go through with a full clinical assessment. Here in Australia, we have an excellent healthcare system which is part state funded and part private. Unfortunately, ADHD and some other neurodevelopmental disorders fall outside the state funded remit because, according to the official policy documents, it's hard for someone with ADHD to meet the eligibility criteria for a severe and permanent disability. So here in Australia, we have to pay to be assessed and we have to pay for follow-up treatments. These do get subsidised slightly, but there's no escaping the fact that in this country, it is not cheap. On finding out the upfront costs, usually around about $1,000, and the ongoing cost of follow-up appointments and medication, some people decide it's not worth the hassle and abandon the process. In countries such as the UK, the diagnosis might be free of charge, care of the old National Health Service, but the waiting lists are several years long. Most people give up and pay for a private assessment. In the USA, the path to an ADHD diagnosis is a lot quicker, but you do of course have to pay handsomely for everything at every stage. In many countries, only a clinical psychiatrist can make an official diagnosis, but in the US, nurse practitioners, family doctors, and social workers can all do so. Getting assessed for ADHD in many countries can be a stressful process, and if the path to a full diagnosis is protracted, it causes some people to abandon it. In order to validate an initial self-diagnosis and prior to going for a full assessment of ADHD, many people take those online tests. These tests do give a general indication of the likelihood of someone having ADHD, but they should never be fully relied upon. In my view, confirmation bias, in which you steer yourself towards the answer that most obviously looks ADHD-like, means it's tough to put much faith in these tests. If nothing else, these pop quiz style ADHD tests do at least give you some idea of the core issues with the disorder if you answer them honestly. And that'll do us for this first episode of my 4-part ADHD survival guide. In the next video, we'll look at the diagnosis process in full and everything that is likely to be required of you.